we have to talk an awful lot about the James Martin crowd these days, and really for most of Francis's alleged papacy. And that's because they have had a rather undue influence in Rome. And when you actually start looking through archival news articles and things from well before Francis was there, you discover that these same men were there practically the whole time. Stories abound of concerned Catholics in the United States and in Europe and other places writing to Rome because they know that there's a McCarrick type priest at their parish and that they have attempted to contact the bishop and the bishop won't do anything about it. So they try to contact Rome and then nothing happens. These stories, there are so many of them that it cannot be a coincidence. And recently, we've come to just sort of take for granted the influence of these James Martin types, these McCarrick types in the Roman curia. We just take it as a fact of life, unfortunately, in the modern period of this crisis in the church. But it doesn't have to be that way. And more people are beginning to realize that, in fact, it does not have to be this way. To the point where there are now whistleblowers quietly emerging who work in the Roman Curia or who work adjacent to the actual Roman Curia and other places in the Vatican. And they're starting to speak up. They're starting to tell the truth and warn Catholics that these things are happening and that there is no reason for us to have to put up with this. They're trying to let us know just how bad this is. And in their warnings given to Catholics, they have let slip that there seems to be like this ruling coalition in Rome between essentially the James Martin types and the non-James Martin types who are Bergoglians. All of them are basically Bergoglians, but that those are the two main factions, and then you find the Jesuits sprinkled throughout. It gives you great insight into just how bad this is. And remember, I am the one of the few who will tell you that the next pope might be a moderate, Benedict XVII, John Paul III type, and that it really won't matter if you get a pope like that because they will not clean house of these figures in the church, in the hierarchy, and so it'll be business as usual. They tried during when all the bad stuff about McCarrick started coming out. They tried to place these problems on Benedict XVI and John Paul II, as if to say those popes were the ones who were the problem there. But yet there are plenty of stories out there of not just laymen, but also even priests and in some cases bishops trying to raise the alarm with the Holy See about problems on the macro scale. And nothing would happen because mail was getting read. Communications promised to be delivered to the Holy Father, never happening. And it was those figures in the Roman Curia doing it. This is a problem in Rome that goes back to probably the 70s, if not earlier. So for this story, which gives us a deep insight into the reality of the new synodal church, we go to the Catholic Herald with this headline. Vatican gripped by a James Martin type and left-wing cliques, says whistleblower. Interesting that they pair the politics in there, but you can't really separate the two. They are, in fact, connected at the hip. They've noticed that side of the political things in the last 20 years have become inseparable from the James Martin subject. That's not an accident. That is by design. And you see this not just in the United States, but it's all across the Western world. And Rome has been essentially captured by those interests. What does that mean for you and I as Catholics? It means you need to keep the faith, you need to be practicing doing acts of penance, fasting, and all these other things in accordance with your state and life. Keeping and living the Fatima message, which includes going to keeping the 5 first Saturdays devotion at least once, getting enrolled in the brown scapular, and not just taking the Sabbatine privilege with the rosary, but taking it to the next step, as Sister Lucia said in the 1950s in an interview, where she said that you are to pray the little office of the Blessed Virgin Mary, in addition to praying your rosary every day and living as best you can according to the brown scapular, pursuing sanctity and all the rest of it. That is the only way out of this. That she is pursuing sanctity. And Advent is a time of year to sort of the practice run for Lent. Because remember, Christmas comes and we have Christmas season, and that will be over in the blink of an eye. Then all of a sudden, Lent will be practically on top of us. Lent is coming. This is your time to be practicing it and to be thinking about your Lenten observances and the effect your Lenten observances can have in this war against princes and principalities. That's what this is. Lent is a great time. Advent is a great time for us to be focused on this. And the liberation and exaltation of the church is one of the classic intentions for your praying and your fasting. And I hope this story today makes it abundantly clear. From the article, quote, a union representing the Vatican's lay employees has distanced itself from an anonymous interview in which a worker complained bitterly about a stranglehold of James Martin types and left wing cliques over the Holy See. The Association of Lay Vatican Employees nevertheless confirmed mounting, quote, tensions and dissatisfaction among the Pope's workforce over poor financial management, also alleged by an anonymous whistleblower. The widely read Italian publication Panorama carried an interview with a Vatican employee identified by the false initials GF, complaining that working in the Vatican today has become, quote, an act of pain and a way of the cross. The source said the Pope was dangerously fickle and had surrounded himself with Spanish speaking favorites with progressive agendas. You can't move up unless you're a friend of one of the two lobbies that count, either the James Martin lobby, which is extensive and very powerful, or the Santa Marta Club around the Pope, he said. Of the latter, he said, if you want to join, you can't read newspapers of the center right, and you have to speak Spanish. You have to be green, pro the extremely poor moving around a bunch, and above all, of the one side in particular in the conflict in the Holy Land. If you're think of the pictures of how the baby Jesus was placed on a rather rather religiously significant and politically significant cloth in a nativity scene in the inside nativity scene at St. Peter's. Be a pro that side. For them, Nicolas Maduro is a saint and 47 is the devil. You also have to pay attention to the sudden changes in Bergoglio's humors and opinions, he said. If you ask for a raise, you risk excommunication. And if you want to be paid for overtime work, they look at you like a troublemaker. He predicted that the Vatican employees would begin mobilizing to voice their discontent shortly after Pope Francis opens the holy doors at St. Peter's Basilica to mark the official beginning of the Jubilee, though he ruled out the idea of a full strike since Vatican labor law does not recognize a right to strike. End quote. That's going to make next year very interesting for news out of Rome, especially given Francis always talks about, the rights of working people and, the poor and the rest. Well, not recognizing those same rights in Vatican City. This is going to make next year very interesting on that score alone. But this is why I don't think who becomes the next pope will matter that much if they are not a firebrand, traditionally minded reformer who plans on cleaning house in Rome. If we don't get that after Francis, and instead we get a moderate who says nice things but does not much, it will be business as usual in Rome because the lifeblood of the Roman curia are like any secular nonprofit these days. The people who do the day-to-day work of running the place are the ones that really, really matter. That's why Vigano has been including them in his talks about the trouble in Rome with his embedded church talk. These are the permanent employees of the Holy See, largely Jesuit in the past and probably still largely so today, and definitely very, very, very much cut from the same cloth as Father James Martin, F.J. Speaking of the Jubilee, I don't know if you heard about this. After dropping the heretical gathering from its calendar, the Vatican has brought back the James Martin pilgrimage for September 2025, which should not surprise anybody at all, and it's directly related to this story, I think. In fact, it explains how this happened. The headline from Crux, which professes to be taking the Catholic pulse, Vatican says the James Martin pilgrimage will return to Jubilee 2025 calendar. Because of course it will. Anybody who was not expecting that was much more optimistic than I was. And again, I've said this every time this story has come up in the last few days, and I will repeat it here. We are not talking about repentant sinners who carry a particular cross for sin that the world finds alluring today. Those who carry that cross of the sin we associate with the name of James Martin, but instead of indulging in that sin, they resist it and they live as Christians have always been expected to live. Those who do that are silent heroes of the faith today. This is not about them. We're talking about the people who identify with their sin, who embrace it, who want the church to change her teachings to make the sin okay. Imagine a scenario instead of this. We're talking about usurers. I'm not talking about like somebody runs a credit card company or something, which is, in my mind, usury. I'm talking when somebody in the secular world uses the term usurer, right? We're talking the old Ebenezer Scrooge type, someone who's just over the top interest, that type. Imagine if the church was getting cozy with them. You wouldn't have that happen. It wouldn't happen. And it would get outrage if it did happen. But this, for whatever reason, gets the applause and lauds of the secular world. And the Vatican is inching along to make all their demands realized, but they're doing it very somewhat slowly. It's jarring, though, that them having a pilgrimage for them in the summer. Here's what they have to say from that article about this. Quote, according to Vatican organizers of 2025 Jubilee year, the on-again, off-again listing of a September 6, 2025 pilgrimage for the James Martin crowd on the official calendar isn't about attempting to squelch or censor anyone, but rather a bureaucratic matter of collecting the necessary information to register an event. When it was first discovered some time ago that a pilgrimage for James Martin types, sponsored by a group called Jonathan's Tent, an Italian group that ministers to the James Martin crowd, had been listed on the Jubilee calendar for September 6, 2025, it caused some consternation among conservative and traditionalist groups. When that registration then suddenly disappeared from the official calendar last week, it became a cause celeb in the Italian media, generating charges that the Vatican had caved into political pressure and canceled the event. In fact, the explanation for the event's disappearance is seemingly more prosaic, according to Agnes Palmucci, a spokesperson for the Dicastery for Evangelization, the Vatican department responsible for Jubilee organization. Over the weekend, Palmucci told Italian media outlets that in conversations with Father Pino Piva, an Italian Jesuit, and of course, an advisor to the Tenda de Giondot group, or the Jonathan's Tent group, it became clear that some of the logistical information the dicastery usually requires to list at an event was missing, so the September 6th pilgrimage was temporarily removed. As soon as the information has been submitted, he said, the James Martin pilgrimage will be returned to the calendar. End quote. Of course they'll be on the calendar again. That's not surprising in the least. If you're watching this, by the way, Father Charles Murr, if you're watching this, maybe could you consider leading or helping organize some kind of novena of reparation for this abominable pilgrimage? I'll promote it here. We'll see if we can get as many people as we can to participate, because reparation is needed. We'll figure out the details of it later, but we need to float this idea out there now, because the very idea of this pilgrimage is diabolical. But this pilgrimage coming back on the calendar, it helps explain what you're seeing with this sort of whistleblower in the Vatican Roman Curia, I would hope. Which brings us back to the main story. You see, the signs are all there that the James Martin crowd basically functionally run everything in the church. And they're trying to normalize their sin. See, what it appears to be is that there's a ruling coalition in Rome between the Jimmy Martin types and the Bergoglians, which, of course, a large overlap between the two. They run every aspect of the Universal Church's governance right now, and there's no reason to think that they didn't have a heavy hand in choosing the new crop of cardinals that were made just a week ago. When you start digging into a lot of the information about the cardinals, not all of them to be sure, but a large number of them seem to be very fine with the James Martin topic. They seem to be his fellow travelers, or at least sympathetic to. That's not a surprise. And they seem to be very, very sympathetic to many of Francis's key sort of ideologically tainted programs, which is virtually all of them. That's not an accident either. So here is the condition this ruling coalition has left the church in. So we go back now to that story about the whistleblower. Here's what they have to say. Quote, he, the whistleblower, asserted that since 2014, the salaries of Vatican personnel have lost a third of their purchasing power. While Vatican-owned apartments, once virtually part of the benefits package for the workforce, have now become so expensive few employees have one. It has also become increasingly more difficult to use the Vatican's health system, he claimed. The whistleblower asserted that since Francis became Pope, financial information has been kept top secret, despite pledges of solidarity. He said traditional decision makers, such as Secretary of State Italian Cardinal Pietro Parolin, who is a front runner to be the next Pope Francis, by the way, at least among most lists out there, he has been shoved aside in favor of a handful of Spanish-speaking papal favorites. Jesuit Father Juan Antonio Guerrero Alves, former head of the Vatican Secretary for the Economy, Maximilio Caballero Ledo, a Spanish business executive and current head of the Secretariat, and Luis Herrera Tejedor, a Spanish layman and director of the Vatican's Human Resources Office. In recent years, we've had the impression that Pope Francis governs the Vatican finances with suspicion and partiality, the whistleblower said. We're state employees who do piecework, required to shut up and show absolute obedience. Working for the Vatican today isn't worth it either, for the salary or the profession, he said. The whistleblower added a comparison between Francis and the last pope to preside over a major Jubilee year. For the 2000 Jubilee, John Paul II gave everyone a bonus of £1,000 and without distinction, while now Pope Francis has announced cuts to our pensions, he says. It's not hard to see the difference. In a statement shortly after the article appeared, the Association of Lay Vatican Employees said that such commentary, employing very harsh tones and offered anonymously, quote, does nothing other than to create confusion and to throw employees into panic. The association said it desires, quote, direct and frank dialogue with Vatican authorities, not indirect attacks in the press. On the other hand, the association is also appearing to suggest that the Vatican itself bears some responsibility for creating the present environment. In fact, the lack of transparency, above all on matters of work and economy and finance, is deleterious and leads to the hardening of hearts, it said. It's a fact that many in the Vatican are concerned about possible cuts to salaries and pensions, especially in conjunction with an increase in the workload for the Jubilee. In that light, the statement urged recognition of a real role of mediation and protection of Vatican workers for the association. We hope this legitimization will occur quickly, the statement said, considering the worrying increase in the climate of tension and dissatisfaction among employees, end quote. And that, folks, is the hidden face of the synodal church, with laymen and clerical staff running most of the church's key operations at the large worldwide level, many of them being of the James Martin types, or at least their spiritual fellow travelers, while also preaching lay involvement in the rest. It's all nonsense. Synodality is on its face. Absolute nonsense. But we kind of knew that already. That shouldn't surprise anybody. But what's not nonsense is this. Feast your eyes on the new synodal church. I don't know if you've seen this, but there's a couple of video clips making the rounds right now that show what it is they have in store for the Catholic Church if they have their way. This was taken at a parish. You can see here at the table altar a priest and his probably concelebrants. Feast your eyes on this, folks. Did I mute this? No, I did not. But there is some odd chanting going on here. Well, this is at a mass, folks. The mass is full of biblical symbolism and things that help to teach faith. I'm not sure what this is all about. But in the Mayan rite, they call it, they are incorporating traditional pre-Christian dances, pre-Christian song, and other things. By the way, that were part of the worship of the demons that they worshiped before the light of the gospel was brought to them. This is being done in a parish, in front of I don't see a tabernacle there, so I guess the really terrible practice in the Novus Ordo of not having a tabernacle often at your altar might be saving grace at this point. But this is not a Catholic practice you're seeing. But this is being done at a Catholic parish, and the bishops or priests and deacons sitting there seem to be completely fine with what you're seeing. That's the new face of the synodal church, by the way. As is this. We go to Michael Haynes on X, who is a LifeSite News reporter who reports on this. He says, Pope Francis met today with the newly elected president of the United Methodist Church, Bishop Deborah Wallace Paget, urging that we must walk together as brothers, pray together, do charity together, and move forward together in dialogue. Let's take a look at what this lady who is pretending to be a bishop has to say.
Hello, I'm Bishop Deborah Wallace Paget, President of the World Methodist Council. I am here with some of my colleagues. We had the privilege a few moments ago of an audience with Pope Francis. It was a great experience. I find him to be a kind person. He has an inspiring vision. He's an ecumenical spirit and a man of deep faith.
Sure, he is. the That's the new face of the Synodal Church. And I'm not being hyperbolic here. There's a actual now news story published by a very mainstream Catholic news source that shows that that is not actually what I'm saying here is not a hyperbolic. So we go to the pillar for this headline. Lay Episcopal delegate added to Eucharistic prayer in Belgian province. So during the actual rite of the Eucharist, during the consecration, the priest, the celebrant, priest, bishop, will say the name of the priest and the bishop, sometimes the auxiliary bishops of their diocese. Well, the bishop, sometimes the auxiliary bishops of the diocese, and the Holy Father in the name the Holy Father in their mass, and that's it. Now they're adding a lay delegate, and here's a picture of that lay delegate. I'm just saying, that's not a coincidence that this is where they're going with this. The lay delegate who helps run the parish is now having her name said in the prayers of the priest at the altar in Belgium. And that seems odd, to say the least. We might call that a novelty. That is a break from how things are done in the Catholic Church, going back to the very beginning of the Church. Typically, the names said by the priest, again, just to repeat myself here, are the name or names of their bishop and that of the Holy Father. That's it. Now we're getting a lay woman's name added to the list as well. The synodalists, for their new religion, are piling novelty upon novelty on the church. And I keep saying new religion. I will remind you that Cardinal Hollerich at the Synod on Synodality, Cardinal Grish, Arthur Roach, the man responsible for trying to suppress the traditional Mass, they've all referred to it as the new synodal church. Why do we need a new synodal church when Jesus Christ established the Catholic Church? I doubt Cardinal Hollerich can do better than Jesus Christ when it comes to establishing a church. But this is the new synodal church. This is the face of the new synodal church. Details from the article, quote, a November 6th, Archdiocesan memo to clergy in the Vicariate of Brabant-Walloon, a French-speaking area south of the capital, Brussels, proposed naming Rebecca Alsberge alongside the Pope and the local bishop in the Eucharistic prayer. In Belgium, an episcopal delegate is a territorial coordinator responsible for a region or of a diocese. The position is called in some countries a regional vicar, though the term vicar is reserved for reference to a priest or bishop. The memo presented several suggestions for how Alsberge, who took up the role in January, could be included in the prayer at the heart of the liturgy of the Eucharist, which follows the liturgy of the Word at Masses. For Eucharistic Prayer 1, it proposed the wording, "We present them in union with your servant, our Pope, name, our Bishop, name, our Episcopal delegate, name, and all those who faithfully keep the Catholic faith received from the apostles." I guess I would then have to exclude everybody they just named here in the current state of things in the church because they're not faithfully keeping the faith as passed on by the apostles, but I digress. The memo said the recommendations were given in consultation with Archbishop Luc Terlinden of Mechelen, Brussels. It is unclear whether the Vatican's dicastery for divine worship, which is responsible for regulation of the liturgy worldwide, was consulted. The general instruction of the Roman Missal, the official guide to the celebration of Mass, describes Eucharistic prayer as, quote, the high point of the whole celebration. It says that in addition to mentioning the Pope and diocesan bishop in the Eucharistic prayer, the celebrant may also mention a coadjutor bishop and auxiliary bishops, but not other bishops who happen to be present, end quote. So the general instruction from the Roman Missal does not allow for anybody who's not essentially a key bishop in the diocese and the Pope to be named at that part of the Mass, but now we're adding the names of lay women to it. And I'm explicitly saying that because this talk of governing dioceses by laity is being paired with this talk of needing to be more inclusive of the ladies in the church for having positions of power. And it's always spoken of in context of power. They're concerned about power dynamics. Power, power, power. That is materialist, secularist thinking of the hammer and sickle variety. That is how they always frame everything. Everything. Go back and read Marx. Go back and read his 20th people in the 20th century he inspired. You will always see it talked about in terms of power. You should be concerned when you hear power dynamics brought up in the church or even in secular politics, because typically power dynamics are a framing of the hammer and sickle ideologues. Some might ask, why is this a big deal? Well, this is, again, a clear break from Catholicism and how the rites of the Mass have been offered historically. This is a diminishing of the bishops and of the priests in favor of the laity. And frankly, I don't think it's a coincidence that we're talking about a female who is helping govern the church here in this obvious test case, because that's what this is. This is a test case, a trial balloon. They're floating this out there to see how people react. I suspect most people are not going to care. That's truly what this is going to be. Most people are simply not going to care. Most Catholics, you might be shocked to learn, if you watch this kind of podcasts and read blogs and things and follow Catholic news closely, you might be shocked to learn that the typical Catholic goes to Mass on Sundays. Maybe the typical pretty good Catholic goes to Mass on Sundays, says their rosary, does the things they're supposed to, but otherwise does not pay any attention to what's going on. And they sometimes wonder, wow, things seem to be changing. So most people won't care. In some ways, I envy them their ability to do that, but unfortunately, some of us feel like we have to pay attention to this dumpster fire that's going on. But that's not all. You see, with that story, it does actually get a little bit worse. So go back for more details. Quote, Terlinden appointed Alberge, a mother of 4, as Episcopal delegate of the Vicariate of Brabant and Walloon on December 19, 2023. The bishop took the step following the retirement of Auxiliary Bishop Jean-Luc Hudson, who had been overseeing the Vicariate since 2011. A spokesman said at the time that Terlinden had taken the decision, quote, with a view to the gradual development of new and complementary ministries in the Archdiocese of Mechlin-Brussels, and after consultation with the Council of Vicariate of Walloon-Brabant, the Presbyterial Council, and the College of Deans, meaning influential lay Catholics were involved in this deforming of the governance of the church. The spokesman noted that Alberge was an assistant to Bishop Hudson, responsible for supporting the Vicariate's pastoral units. She began a 5-year term on January 1st of this year. Terlinden also appointed the dean, Father Alain de Mer, as Alberg's deputy for a 5-year term with responsibility for ordained ministers. These appointments seek to fit into the vision of a synodal and missionary church developed by our Pope Francis, the spokesman said. Following her nomination, Alsberg said, my tasks will be the same as those of Bishop Hudson, except for liturgical duties. Again, this is diminishing the role of bishops, of priests in the hierarchy. The whole point of synodality is to make your priests and bishops indistinguishable from laymen, with the one exception that they are dispensers of sacraments, and that is it. What is the point of being an apostolic person if you cannot be distinguished from a lay person? Again, this is not Catholicism. This is something else. The November 6th memo to clergy offered indications for the Eucharistic prayer and Masses in the Episcopal delegates' presence and a desire for coherence within the Vicariate. With regard to the Eucharistic prayer, the indications take into account the repeated request from priests and faithful to be able to pray together for their new vicar. We will therefore add either her title and first name to the Eucharistic prayer, said the letter signed by Alberge and de Mer. For celebrations in which the delegate will be present, we will give you some guidelines on how she should speak and her physical place in the assembly. These guidelines should be completed by discussing them with her before she visits your parish or pastoral unit. I can already picture one of the seats for the presiders at the Mass being reserved for this person. I can already see it. The guidelines suggest Alberge could speak after the greetings at the start of Mass, after the proclamation of the Gospel, or before the blessing at the end of Mass. A report published in May by cathobel.be, the official website of the French-speaking Catholic Church in Belgium, suggested that Alberge has offered a homily in 2 voices during a visit to a parish in Blocry, alongside the priest, Father Charles Delhez. An accompanying photograph showed her speaking standing behind Delhez. She's helping give homilies now. Again, this has never been done in the history of the church. The November 6th memo also suggests that during the entrance procession, the Episcopal delegate should stand beside the presiding priest and then be seated in front row of the church. Following the recessional, she should greet parishioners alongside the priest. It said the guidelines encourage the priest to offer the sign of peace to the delegate while going to give the peace to the assembly. And it goes on like that. It's not Catholicism, folks. It's something else. I don't know what it is. Looks like Anglicanism, sort of. But this is what modernism, for 6 decades, has wrought on the church. A transformation into something new. That is the truth of things. Edgy says we're sort of starved for hopeful videos these days. Well, I've done good news videos before, and I hate to break it to you, nobody watches them. If I put good news in the title, rarely does anybody watch them. There isn't also, but I do try to do them anyway, and there just isn't good news. I haven't seen good news in the church. It's been a long time. Other than, Francis saying one thing that he then contradicts with his actions later. That is the problem. Somebody's saying that they are shocked that this woman has an office doing the things the bishop does, except for liturgical duties. Yeah, that's what's happening. It's at the end of the day, the way out of this is prayer, penance, fasting. Our Lord talked to a sinner in the Gospels about how this is the kind of demon that can only be removed through prayer and fasting. What do you think that is for the church? Catholics need to begin picking up our old practices again, as painful as it is, one at a time, as each individual, and keeping the 5 first Saturdays, wearing the brown scapular, and actually going beyond the Sabbatine privilege, including the praying of the little office of the Blessed Virgin Mary, in addition to your rosary. We need to start doing all those things. Sister Lucia told us how to do it almost a century ago now, which is scary to think about. But that's where we are. That is where we are as a church. Curious if you're surprised at all that it's Belgium where this is happening. If you know anything about the history of Belgium in the post-conciliar era, I don't think it'll surprise you that much. But if you're watching this from Belgium or if you're very familiar with Belgium, let me know in the comments. Are you surprised by this? That at the end of the day, the hotbed of modernism in the church is, aside from Rome, it seems to be Belgium is one of those places that keeps popping up, these places where the bad news comes, the most experimental things in the church keep coming from. Let me know in the comments what you think about this, and as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.